Surely you all know that a person who is ordained a priest must be a kind and exemplary person, right? But in today's story, a famous priest in the town of Saint Marie, who is admired and respected by everyone here, is someone who hides a terrible secret. An affair with a young woman leads to the collapse of a perfect family and an unforgivable crime. In the center of town, there stands out an ancient church with a towering bell tower, where Father John Hartman has served for the past 15 years. John is a 45-year-old man with gray hair and deep eyes that reflect experience and fatigue. He came to Saint Marie after giving up his noisy life in New Orleans, looking for peace and the opportunity to serve this small community. In the eyes of the people of Saint Marie, John was more than just a priest. He is the town's spiritual pillar, the person they come to when they are in trouble or need comfort. John lives with his wife Sarah and 3 children in a southern-style bungalow located right next to the church. Sarah is a beautiful and gentle woman, always dedicated to taking care of her family and supporting her husband's work. Even though life seemed peaceful, Sarah always felt like there was something missing in their marriage. The years of living together have made their feelings fade, no longer as passionate as in the beginning. But because of family and responsibilities, Sarah always tries to maintain a happy appearance. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were John and Sarah's pride and joy. They are raised in a moral and well-educated environment, with the hope that one day they will become useful people to society. The Hartman family's life seemed perfect. No one could have thought that under that peaceful appearance there were dark secrets. The town's peace begins to be disturbed when a young woman, Evelyn, appears. Evelyn comes from New Orleans, bringing with her a charming beauty and a mysterious past. She rented a small house on the edge of town, near the swamp, and began to attract people's attention with her charming appearance and independent lifestyle. Evelyn regularly goes to church, but unlike other parishioners, she always finds a way to approach and talk to Priest John. During a meeting at church, John was attracted at first sight when Evelyn walked in with a gentle smile and deep eyes. She was unlike any woman John had ever met. The combination of her sharp beauty and the melancholy look in her eyes made John unable to take his eyes off her. For the first time in many years, John felt his heart flutter, a feeling he thought he had lost a long time ago. From then on, Evelyn often came to John with the reason of needing spiritual advice. Their conversations initially revolved around stories about life, faith, and the loneliness that Evelyn suffered after leaving the big city. John listened to her with sympathy, but he didn't realize that with each conversation, Evelyn gradually crept into his mind, making it more and more difficult for him to keep the distance between them. The town of Saint Marie, with its peaceful appearance and honest people, did not know that under the surface, an underground wave was silently rising. The relationship between John and Evelyn becomes increasingly complicated, and it will not only disrupt their own lives, but also drag those around them into an inevitable tragedy. The conversations between John and Evelyn gradually became indispensable in both of their lives. They initially met in the church's counseling room, where John often listened and offered spiritual advice to struggling parishioners. But gradually, these meetings became more than just spiritual consultations. Evelyn is a sophisticated and skillful woman. She knows how to talk to evoke emotions hidden deep inside John, emotions that he has buried for a long time. Every time she talked about her pain, loneliness, and longing for love, John felt like she was talking about herself. He felt deep sympathy for Evelyn, and gradually he began to share his feelings with her, something he had never done with anyone else. Late one afternoon, after everyone had left the church, John and Evelyn sat together in a small back room. Outside, it began to rain, heavy raindrops falling on the roof, creating a sad sound. In the dim candlelit room, they sat facing each other, not saying a word, but both felt the tension and desire filling the space. Evelyn was the first to break the silence. She gently held John's hand, her eyes filled with tears as she talked about the pain she had endured in the past, about the time she was betrayed and abandoned. She said that, Throughout her life, she had never felt understood and shared like when she talked to John. She thanked him for always being by her side, listening to her, and helping her regain faith in life. John felt his heart sink. He knows that this relationship has crossed the line of propriety, but he cannot resist Evelyn's attraction. In that moment, John lost control. He bent down and gently kissed Evelyn's hand, then pulled her into his arms. They shared their first kiss, a kiss full of guilt, but also full of desire. That night, all the barriers in John's mind collapsed. He was no longer the devoted priest the town knew, but became a man full of passion and sin. The secret love affair between them began from there, and every day, John fell deeper into this taboo relationship. They met in secret, in places where no one could detect them. Evelyn becomes the person John thinks of every time he closes his eyes, and guilt begins to eat him up from the inside. Sarah, John's wife, began to notice unusual signs. She feels that John is gradually distancing himself and no longer cares about the family like before. John's evenings away from home became more frequent, and when he came home, he often appeared tired and withdrawn. Sarah, a sensitive woman, cannot help but sense that something is going on, something she is not privy to. Sarah decides to follow John. She knew that this wasn't right, but she couldn't bear to live in doubt and worry any longer. One night, when John left the house late, Sarah silently followed him. She witnessed her husband enter Evelyn's small house in Sarah and decided to follow John. She knew that this wasn't right, but she couldn't bear to live in doubt and worry any longer. One night when John left the house late, Sarah silently followed him. She witnessed her husband enter Evelyn's small house on the edge of town. Sarah's heart broke as she saw John and Evelyn embracing each other in the dim light. But instead of immediately confronting her, Sarah silently collected evidence to expose the truth. Sarah began secretly reading John's messages, monitoring his meetings with Evelyn, and secretly recording their conversations. The more she discovered, the more resentful Sarah became, but also filled with fear about what might happen if John discovered what she was doing. John, meanwhile, is immersed in his relationship with Evelyn, forgetting everything else. Each time they meet, they sink deeper into sin and uncontrollable passion. But the feeling of guilt began to creep into John's mind. He knew that this relationship was not only an ethical violation, but also threatened to destroy the entire life he had built. One evening, when John returned home from a meeting with Evelyn, Sarah was waiting. She confronts John, presenting all the evidence she has collected. The heated argument between them took place right in the living room, where every word seemed to tear apart the peaceful space of the house. Sarah demands that John end his relationship with Evelyn immediately and return to his family, or she will expose the truth to everyone. John, cornered, doesn't know what to do. He knew that if everything got out, not only would his priestly career end, but he would also lose his entire family. In a panic, John began to lose control. Screams rang out, causing their children to wake up and see a horrifying scene between their parents. Sarah, seeing that John has no intention of ending the relationship, becomes desperate. She began threatening to leave him and take all 3 children with her. This caused John to fall into a state of despair, afraid of losing everything. In a moment of madness, John killed Sarah by strangling her. Sarah's screams scared their children and made them cry, but John was consumed by complete madness. Not stopping there, John continued his gruesome actions by killing all 3 children, leaving no one to witness his crime. He quietly hid their bodies in his car, then drove to an abandoned house in the woods, a place no one knew about. After everything ended, John returned home with shaking hands, his heart haunted by what he had just done. He knew there was no going back and his sins would forever haunt him for the rest of his life. After the horrific crime occurred, John returned home with a feeling of emptiness and panic. He began experiencing horrifying nightmares every night. In his dream, he saw images of Sarah and her children appearing with empty, reproachful and haunted eyes. John woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, and a feeling of guilt gripped him relentlessly. Evelyn, meanwhile, begins to notice a strange change in John's behavior. He became distant, quiet, and often lost his soul. Their meetings were no longer the same, as John was often lost in thought and no longer showed the same passion as before. Evelyn begins to suspect that something terrible has happened, and she decides to investigate. One day, Evelyn went to see John at church, but instead of the usual warmth, she only saw a tired and lost man. She tried to ask John, but he just shook his head and said everything was fine. Evelyn didn't believe it, and when she left the church, she decided to follow John, hoping to find something to answer her doubts. Meanwhile, in the town of St. Marie, the disappearance of Sarah and her children begins to attract attention. Neighbors began asking questions, and the police also began investigating. An anonymous letter was sent to the police, implying that the Hartman family had been murdered and that the suspect was none other than John Hartman. The police began to collect evidence. They searched John's house and discovered faint traces of poorly hidden blood. Witnesses in town also began recounting details they had previously overlooked, such as screams in the night and strange lights from the Hartman house. Evelyn, in a secret meeting with John, tried to pull him out of his depression. She wanted to know the truth, but John just quietly confessed that he had committed a terrible crime. Evelyn was horrified. She felt deceived and became afraid of the man she once loved. She knew that if she didn't act, John might hurt her too. John lost more and more control. Haunting images of his family continued to haunt him, and he began to hear whispers in his head, blame and condemnation from the people he had killed. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and gradually fell into a state of desperate panic. The police, after discovering important clues, began to approach John. They realized that they could not let him hide from the truth forever, and plans to arrest him began to take place. The police, after collecting enough evidence, began implementing a plan to arrest John Hartman. They were well aware that John was a dangerous person and would likely react violently if cornered. The police force was mobilized. They secretly surrounded John's house early one morning when the town of St. Marie was still sleeping. Meanwhile, John has almost completely lost his mind. He heard quiet footsteps outside, the sound of the window opening and then closing gently in the night wind. The whispering voices of Sarah and her children grew louder, as if they were calling to him from afar. John saw their silhouettes in the dark corners of the room, on the walls, under the bed, and in his own face when looking into the broken mirror. The sympathy between Emily and Alex is growing more and more. The two began to share things with each other that they could hardly tell anyone else. Emily sees in Alex a boy who needs to be loved and cared for, while Alex sees in Emily someone he can trust and rely on. The relationship between them gradually becomes more complicated, no longer just the relationship between teacher and student. Evelyn, although frightened by John's attitude, still tried to stay calm. "John, I know you made a mistake, but we can get through this together. Don't let it be too late," she said, her voice soft but determined. John shook his head, a crooked smile appearing on his face. "It's too late, Evelyn. No one can save me, not you, not God," he said, his voice seeming to turn into dry laughter. He pulled out a knife from his pocket, the sharp blade glinting in the dim light in the church. Evelyn felt her heart pounding. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving John. She realized that he had decided to end things himself, and that if he didn't act quickly, things would get out of control. She glanced around the church, looking for any way to stop him. Outside, police surrounded the church, knowing that the situation was becoming more dangerous than ever. They prepared to rush in, but every action must be carefully considered to avoid any losses. A police officer signaled to his teammates, preparing to enter from the main and secondary entrances. John stood there, blade in hand, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and mental breakdown. He began to mutter Bible verses, like someone praying one last time before entering the afterlife. Evelyn didn't know what to do. She could only stand there, hoping that some miracle would happen. At that moment, the police rushed in, flashlights glaring in the dark room. John put down the knife. "Don't do anything foolish," a policeman shouted, his gun pointed straight at him. John turned his head and looked at the police with a crazy smile. "They're here, Evelyn. Do you see? I told you it was too late," he whispered. And then, quick as a flash, he raised the blade to his neck. Evelyn screamed in horror, but it was too late. The sharp blade cut through flesh, and John collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from the wound. The police rushed in, trying to stop the bleeding and save his life, but it seemed he was determined not to let himself survive the night. In the final moments, as the light from life gradually disappeared, John found himself standing in front of a large gate. On the other side of the gate were Sarah and her children. They looked at him with reproachful eyes. John knew that he would never be forgiven and that he would have to live in eternal punishment. After John's death, the Church of St. Marie fell into a heavy silence. The people of the town are shocked by the truth about the priest they once respected. Stories about the Hartman family became a topic of discussion for everyone, from the elderly to children who did not understand. Evelyn, the last person to witness John's death, feels weighed down by guilt and remorse. She left St. Marie soon after, leaving no trace. In the following days, she lived haunted by what happened, of the blind love that brought her to an irreparable tragedy. The town of St. Marie returned to its original peace, but those who know the story of the Hartman family will never forget. The Church of St. Marie, once a symbol of faith and spiritual guidance, has now become a place to avoid, where the shadow of sin and betrayal still lurks. The police completed the investigation, but the case ended with many wounds that never healed. The people of the town continued with their lives, but the loss of a family and the death of a man once considered holy forever left an indelible stain on St. Marie's history. Evelyn never returned to town again. She lives a wandering life, searching for forgiveness that she knows she can never receive. She couldn't forget what had happened, and every time she looked in the mirror, she saw images of John, Sarah, and the children, looking at her with reproachful eyes. Evelyn knew that, until the end of her life, she would always be haunted by that dark past.